All right, so now that we've improved our development flow a little bit using NodeDaemon and BabelNode, the next thing that we're going to do is learn how to connect to MongoDB from inside our server. Okay, so the way that we're going to do this, and first of all, you're going to want to make sure that you have the MongoDB driver installed, which you can do by running npm install MongoDB. So we'll hit enter, and that will install that package. And the next thing that we're going to do is inside that server file, we're going to import something called Mongo client from that package. So that's going to look like this. We're going to say import Mongo client from MongoDB. And basically what this Mongo client thing is an object that we can use to create a connection to our local Mongo database from inside our JavaScript code. Okay, so this is kind of similar to what we did in the terminal when we just typed Mongo and opened up a shell, except now the one that's actually going to be running the commands is our Node.js and Express code here. So that's what Mongo client does essentially. It's the way that we create a connection to our Mongo database locally is pretty straightforward. We say const client equals await Mongo client dot connect. Okay, and then as an argument here, we pass the URL of the database that we want to connect to. Okay, so just like our front end could make requests to our back end using a specific URL, our back end is going to connect to the database using a specific URL. Now the URL we're going to want here is going to be MongoDB : / and then localhost, right? So MongoDB runs on localhost as well when we're on a local machine. And the port number by default that MongoDB is going to run on is 27017. Don't ask me why they chose that number. I'm sure there is a reason, but I've never looked it up. And the last thing we need is we're going to put the name of the database we want to connect to as the final segment to this. So that's going to be FSR to-dos. And in addition to the URL, we have to pass a configuration object to Mongo client. And there's really just two main things that we need to pass here. Both of them just have to do with MongoDB compatibility. So don't worry too much about these because they do have slightly confusing names. The first one is called useNewURLParser, and we need to set that to true. And the second one is useUnifiedTopology. And we're going to set that to true as well. Again, all this is for compatibility reasons with older versions of MongoDB, so don't worry too much about these. Anyway, that is how we connect to a local Mongo database. If you were going to connect to another database, like let's say you were hosting a Mongo database on the cloud, all you would have to do is change this URL to something else, and you might have to include some kind of username and password in that as well. But for now, our Mongo database is just local, so we can access it using this URL here. All right, so since we're using await with Mongo client.connect because it is an asynchronous function, what we need to do is basically put this inside its own function, which will be asynchronous. Now, again, if you're not familiar with async and await, don't worry too much about it. Just know that whenever you use await, it has to be inside an async function. And we're just going to create a function called start that we're essentially going to put all of our server code inside of. So what this is going to look like, we're going to say const start equals async. Okay, and inside there we're going to put all of our server code so far. And what that will do is it will allow us to use this client thing inside all of our routes. So we're going to be using client inside our routes to basically connect to the database and perform whatever kind of changes we need. All right, and then down at the bottom, we need to actually call that start function like this, and that should basically start everything up. So last thing, before we actually get started switching over our routes to use MongoDB, is we're going to delete this fake to-dos array since we won't need it anymore. Okay. Now, one last thing, let's try and run this just to make sure everything is good. We're going to say npm run dev, hit enter, and we should see server is listening on port 8080. Although, if you try and send a request now to any of the endpoints, you'll get an error because the fake to-dos is no longer in existence, right? We just deleted it. So that's how you create a basic connection to MongoDB. And the last thing we need to do here is get a reference to the actual database. Okay, so this is similar to how we typed use FSR to-dos inside the Mongo terminal. To do that, we just have to say const db equals client.db, and then we pass the db name by saying FSR to-dos, like that. And that's all we need to do to connect to our database inside the server and start making requests to it. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.